The ocean was our escape. From the time Christian was old enough to run into the surf, we had made the Pacific our second home. He was barely 6 when he caught his first wave, and I still remember the way he looked at me after, salt water dripping from his hair, eyes wide with exhilaration. "Did you see that, Mom?" he had gasped, grinning so wide it hurt my heart. Had seen. Had always seen. Now, at 24, Christian, Chris, as I had called him since he was a baby, was a man. Broad-shouldered, confident, with a quiet strength that reminded me of the years we had spent just the two of us, weathering every storm life had thrown our way. His father had left before he was born, and I had never once regretted my decision to walk away. A man who could lay hands on a woman in anger was not a man I wanted raising my son. So I had done it alone. And somehow, in all those years of scraped knees, late-night fevers, and whispered secrets over bowls of cereal, Chris had become not just my son, but my best friend. That's how we ended up here, on the deck of a yacht, floating somewhere between Malibu and Catalina Island. The idea had been his. "Mom, let's rent a boat. Real one. Just for a weekend." I had laughed at first, thinking it was another of his spontaneous ideas that would fizzle out in the face of practicality. But Chris had saved, planned. And now, here we were, stretched out on cushioned deck chairs under a sky so blue it looked like it had been painted just for us. "You're smiling," he noted, tipping his sunglasses down to look at me. I shrugged, adjusting my sun hat. "I like it here." He grinned, reaching for the champagne bottle in the ice bucket between us. "Me too. More." I lifted my glass, letting him pour. The bubbles fizzed as I watched the way the sunlight glinted off the water, turning it into something ethereal. "I still can't believe you pulled this off," I admitted, taking a sip. Chris laughed, the sound deep and full of life. "You doubt me." "Not doubt," I said, tilting my head toward him. "Just surprised." "This is a lot, Chris." "You deserve a lot, Mom," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made me go still. "You've given me everything my whole life. I wanted to give you something back." I swallowed around the sudden lump in my throat, looking away. The breeze was warm, the salt thick in the air. "I didn't do anything special," I murmured, but Chris scoffed. "You raised me alone. You worked 2 jobs just to keep us afloat. You gave me every opportunity. That's special." I glanced at him then, my son who had grown into a man so kind, so full of life. The kind of man his father could never be. And then it happened. Something shifted in the air. It was subtle, a current of energy passing between us like the tide shifting beneath the boat. I saw it in the way Chris looked at me, really looked at me, as if seeing me not just as his mother but as a person, woman, someone who had spent so much time giving. She had forgotten what it meant to receive. I shivered, though the sun was warm against my skin. Chris noticed. "Cold?" he asked, reaching for a towel. I hesitated but shook my head. "No, I'm fine." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't press. Instead, he leaned back, stretching out, the muscles in his arms flexing as he did. I watched him in my peripheral vision, my thoughts scattered like seashells along the shore. What was this? This feeling? I told myself it was nothing. Just the champagne. The sun. The peace of being out here, away from everything. But deep down I knew better. Chris sighed, rubbing a hand over his face before looking at me again. "You ever think about it?" I turned my head slightly. "Think about what?" He gestured vaguely. "Life. If things had been different." I exhaled, long and slow. "I try not to." "Why?" "Because it doesn't change anything." Chris studied me for a moment, then set his glass down. "But if you could change one thing." I hesitated. Would I have stayed? Endured a man who was willing to hurt me, just to give Chris a father? Would I have chosen something different for myself? I shook my head. I wouldn't change a thing. Chris's lips quirked, but there was something unreadable in his expression. He reached for the champagne again, pouring himself another glass, and I let my gaze drift back to the water, my thoughts churning as steadily as the waves. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was thick with something else. Something I didn't have the words for. Chris finally sighed. I wouldn't change anything either. I turned to him, surprised. No. He shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. Had you? That was enough. The words nearly broke me. Because I had spent so much of my life wondering if I had done enough. If my love, my effort, had been enough to fill the space his father left behind. But Chris had never once looked at me with resentment. Never once made me feel like I had failed him. And now, as we sat here on this boat, suspended between sea and sky, I realized something. He had been enough for me too. I reached over, taking his hand in mine, squeezing it gently. Chris didn't pull away. For the first time in a long, long time I felt at peace. The ocean stretched before us, endless and unknowable. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. I had Chris. And that was all I needed. The sun had begun its slow descent into the horizon, bleeding gold and orange across the sky, casting its reflection on the water like a path leading somewhere unknown. Chris leaned against the railing of the yacht, his fingers absently tracing the condensation on his glass. I watched him, sipping my champagne, feeling the warmth of the day settle into my skin. The energy between us had been shifting ever since we set sail, something unspoken but undeniable crackling in the air. Chris was staring out at the ocean, lost in thought. "What's on your mind?" I asked, setting my glass down. He glanced at me, then smiled, soft, easy, but with something else behind it. "Nothing." I arched an eyebrow. "Liar." He laughed, shaking his head before reaching for his phone. "All right, maybe not nothing. I was just thinking, it's been a long time since we just did something like this. No stress. No worries. Just as." I nodded, leaning back in my chair. "Yeah, feels nice." Chris tapped at his phone, and suddenly, the familiar opening chords of one of my favorite songs filled the air. I blinked, smiling as recognition hit me. "You remembered," I murmured. "Of course," he said, grinning. "You used to dance to this in the kitchen all the time." I laughed, shaking my head at the memory. "I did, didn't I?" Chris stood, holding out a hand. "Come on, Mom. Dance with me." I stared at his outstretched palm, a little hesitant. "Chris." "No excuses," he cut me off, wiggling his fingers. "Just one dance." A playful challenge flickered in his eyes, and I couldn't help but smile. Shaking my head, I set my glass aside and took his hand. The deck was steady beneath my bare feet as he pulled me up. The music swayed around us, soft and slow, and I let myself sink into the moment. Chris kept his grip gentle, leading me effortlessly. His movements easy and sure. I laughed as I spun under his arm, my hair catching in the breeze. "I had no idea you could actually dance," I teased. Chris smirked. "You'd be surprised what I've picked up over the years." I felt light, free in a way I hadn't in a long time. The sun painted everything in gold, and for a moment I let go of everything else, just feeling the rhythm, the warmth of the moment. And then I noticed something. Chris was watching me. Not in the way a son usually looks at his mother. There was something different in his eyes. Something quiet and intense, like he was seeing me for the first time. My breath hitched, but I kept moving, twirling beneath his hand again, trying to ignore the strange flutter in my chest. "What?" I asked lightly, trying to break the silence. Chris blinked as if realizing he had been staring. He let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "Nothing. It's just... you're beautiful when you dance." I stopped, my heart stuttering in my chest. It was such a simple thing to say, but something about the way he said it, the softness in his voice, it made my stomach twist. I searched his face, but Chris only smiled, his hand still holding mine. Before I could say anything, he pulled me into another spin, stepping closer. I felt the warmth of him, the solidness of his presence, and for the briefest moment, something shifted. Something impossible. I looked up at him and Chris looked back, his gaze searching, uncertain yet steady. The ocean rocked beneath us, the music wrapping around us, and the world seemed to hold its breath. I didn't understand what I was feeling. All I knew was that I didn't want the moment to end. The song faded, but neither of us moved. Chris's fingers tightened slightly around mine, his jaw clenching like he was fighting something inside himself. His eyes were darker now, the easy playfulness gone, replaced by something else. "Chris," I whispered, unsure of what I was even trying to say. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Sorry." He shook his head, laughing under his breath, but it was strained. That was different. I swallowed hard, nodding. It was. Silence stretched between us, heavy, filled with unspoken things neither of us knew how to voice. Chris looked like he wanted to say something, but instead he turned away, resting his hands on the railing, staring out at the horizon. I let out a slow breath, steadying myself. The air was charged now, something unnameable lingering between us. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know if I wanted to. All I knew was that something had changed, and there was no going back. The wind had picked up slightly, sending small ripples across the ocean's surface. The sun was lower now, casting long golden streaks across the water, turning everything soft and dreamlike. But the air between Chris and me was anything but light. I could still feel the echo of our dance, the way his hand had held mine just a little longer than necessary, the way he had looked at me with something unreadable in his eyes. It had been a moment unlike any we'd ever had before, something fragile yet unshakable. Chris stood by the railing, gripping it tightly, his back to me as the waves rocked the yacht gently. I could tell he was thinking, overthinking just like I was. I took a breath, trying to steady myself. "Chris," I said softly, stepping closer. He turned his head slightly, but he didn't meet my eyes. "That was weird, right?" he asked, laughing, though it wasn't his usual carefree laugh. It was forced, awkward, as if he was trying to push the moment away. I swallowed. "I don't know." He exhaled, finally looking at me. His eyes were full of something I couldn't quite name. Me neither. Silence settled between us again, stretching long and thin like a fragile thread, ready to snap. I tried to shake off the strange energy in the air. Maybe it was just the moment. The music, the ocean, the champagne. Chris ran a hand through his hair. Maybe. But neither of us seemed convinced. I turned and leaned on the railing beside him, staring out at the horizon where the sky met the sea in a seamless blur of blues and oranges. "You know, when you were little, you used to grab my hands and spin me around the kitchen," I said, my voice light, trying to ground us in something familiar. "You always made me dance with you. No music, just your little feet stomping around." Chris chuckled softly. "I remember. You'd always laugh at me when I got the steps wrong. You were 6. You didn't know there were steps." We both laughed, and for a moment things felt normal again, safe, easy. But then Chris turned to me, leaning his elbow on the railing, his expression suddenly serious. "But this wasn't like that," he said quietly. I stiffened slightly. "No," I admitted. "It wasn't." The ocean rocked the boat gently, and I realized how close we were standing now. Chris's presence was warm beside me, steady and familiar. He was my son, my best friend, my entire world. So why did it feel like something between us had shifted in a way I couldn't explain? Chris looked down at his hands, then back at me. His jaw tensed like he was debating whether to say something. "Mom," he started, then hesitated. Something in my chest tightened. Before he could finish, a strong gust of wind blew across the deck, making my sun hat fly off my head. "Oh!" I gasped as it tumbled toward the railing, but Chris was already moving. He reached for it at the same time I did, and in the next second we collided. His hands catching mine, his body just inches from mine. For a moment we froze. I could feel his breath warm against my skin. His hand still held mine, steady, unmoving. His eyes locked onto mine, dark and searching, and something deep inside me twisted, unfamiliar and overwhelming. The world felt very still. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. And then, just as quickly, Chris blinked, pulling back slightly, breaking whatever invisible force had held us there. He let out a breath and dropped his hands. "Sorry," he murmured. I swallowed hard, stepping back, forcing out a laugh that didn't quite sound natural. It's okay. But it wasn't. Something had shifted. Something I didn't know how to name. Chris ran a hand over his face, shaking his head as if trying to clear a thought away. I think I need some air. I almost laughed at that. What did he think was surrounding us? But I only nodded, watching as he moved toward the other side of the deck. And as I stood there watching him, I realized something. No matter how much I wanted to deny it, no matter how much I tried to blame it on the champagne or the setting or the nostalgia, something between us had changed. The sun had long since set, leaving the sky draped in deep indigo, the stars scattered like flecks of light over an endless abyss. The yacht rocked gently with the rhythm of the waves, the distant hum of the ocean filling the quiet space between us. Chris sat across from me on the deck, leaning back on his hands, his face illuminated only by the soft glow of the small lantern between us. His expression was unreadable, his gaze distant, lost somewhere beyond the horizon. I watched him, feeling the weight of the past few days pressing down on me. "You're thinking too hard," I murmured, breaking the silence. Chris let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "You always know, huh?" I smiled faintly. "I know you better than anyone." He turned his head then, looking at me, really looking at me. His dark eyes held something heavy, something he hadn't yet put into words. "I need to say something," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. A strange sense of anticipation coiled in my chest. "Okay," I said cautiously. Chris took a slow breath, as if bracing himself. "Mom, I don't know when it happened, but somewhere along the way, things changed for me. The way I see you. The way I feel when I'm with you." A strange pressure tightened in my chest. I wasn't sure if it was fear, confusion, or something else entirely. "Chris, just let me say it," he interrupted gently. "I know how it sounds. I know what this is supposed to be. But I can't pretend anymore. Not to you. Not to myself." His words sent a shiver through me. I tried to steady my breathing to make sense of what was happening, but the truth was I had felt something too. Shift. A change in the way we moved around each other. "Chris," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the waves. "This isn't." "It is," he cut in. "It's real. And I know you feel it too." I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my ears. "We don't have to pretend," he said softly. "Not out here. Not when it's just us." I closed my eyes for a brief moment, trying to gather my thoughts, but all I could feel was the warmth of the moment, the weight of his gaze, the intimacy of the night pressing in around us. Chris reached for my hand, his touch hesitant, seeking permission. "Mom, I love you," he whispered. "Not just as my mother, but as someone who's been my best friend. My everything." My heart twisted painfully at his words. "This doesn't have to be wrong," he murmured. "We can live however we want. No one has to know. No one would even question us." I exhaled shakily, my mind a whirlwind of emotions, but the look in his eyes held me still. He was serious. He wasn't confused or lost. He had made up his mind. And deep down I knew so had I. The past, the labels, the rules. None of it seemed to matter in that moment. All that mattered was us. All that mattered was what we felt. And in that quiet, starlit night, with the ocean stretching endlessly around us, I knew there was no going back. Everything had changed. Forever.